Hey there, my name is Hazel Weekly, and I have thoughts, lots of thoughts. They never stop thinking and they never stop thinking. And I am really excited today to come here and share with you so many of my thoughts around abstractions, namely abstractions as bridges. As it turns out, the word abstraction is kind of abstract. And when you think of what you're trying to do, when you have to develop this really complicated setup, this really sort of taking a group of people, having them learn an idea, having them develop this idea and understand it and solve a problem, and then build from that problem to a more complex one. Just keep going on from there. You end up running out of words to describe what you're doing. And so you just kind of call it build an abstraction. But it's also kind of like building a bridge. Because you're building a bridge from one idea to the other, then that idea goes on to the next one, and that idea goes on to the next one. Kind of like a bridge. And so I want to start off by talking about a previous company that I used to work at. And one of the situations that I was faced there, and how to kind of set the stage, how we were thinking about the abstractions, because this particular company formed a lot of the basis for my very monstrous, nearly 16,000 word blog post that maybe some of you have read a little bit that spawned this talk itself. So that company had a particular problem, which was they perceived of themselves in a certain way, and they perceived of the problems that they were doing, and they understood the problems in a particular way that made it extraordinarily hard to solve the actual problem. For example, one of the things that they strongly believed at the company was that the problem that they're solving is fairly simple technically. And the hard part is the network effect, getting people to buy it, to use it, to consume it. Consequently, they overcomplicated nearly every single technical decision because it was simple. And furthermore, another thing that they very strongly believed was stream processing is hard. And it also doesn't fit with how the company should be used or should consume data or should have customers or onboard. And so nobody ever thought about it. And everything in the entire company was built around the idea that you do batch processing, which sounds great until you learn that you are overpaying for your data processing pipeline by about 90% because you're actually using the wrong abstraction. And not only are you using the wrong abstraction and having that hamper your costs, it actually ended up creating phantom products where the abstractions that people wanted from the company didn't fit what the company sold on the website, but it fit what people were paying for. And so you had all these invisible products buried inside customer support or customer success, and it was a giant tangled mess that led to horrific amounts of busy work, nonsense, shenanigans, and more. And one thing that was perennially sort of fascinating to me was the amount of times that you would have a developer talk about something, only for an engineering manager to say, no, 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 that's not correct. But then when they countered and corrected the engineer, they would be agreeing with each other, but talking past each other. And then the product manager would come in and they would disagree with both of them and reiterate the same exact idea, but just with slightly different words. And then the salespeople would come in and say, nobody wants this. What they want is, and then they would describe the exact same thing that everybody else is talking about. And it sounds like a comedic sketch from Seinfeld or something, but I saw this so many times. And not even at this company, but almost every company I've ever worked at. And why is it so hard to just name something, to just have a concept and understand what that concept is? Why is it so hard to build abstractions? So if I think about an abstraction and I think about these bridges, you have to start somewhere, right? You can't just magic the entire company into existence Everything starts from Hello World. Everything starts from a simple little idea. So if I think about bridges, how do you actually build a bridge? Well, it turns out bridges are built out of 10-year bridges, and 10-year bridges are built out of 10-year bridges, and 10-year bridges are built out of 10-year bridges, and 10-year bridges are built out of. And somehow you can build this giant, massive bridge over the water, over open sea, this massive, fantastical bridge that ocean liners can go under, semi trucks and lorries and like everything can just drive over this bridge. And how did they build it when it's 3 kilometers long? Like, you can't just drop it in the middle. You don't have a crane big enough for that. Some of these bridges are even visible from space. How do you build these things? And pretty much all of them universally start from a tiny little thing. But you can't actually start from the little thing because even the little thing itself doesn't have any support. So what you do is you build the support first, and then you can build the bridge. And it turns out once you build the support, you almost don't even really need to build the bridge because the support practically is the bridge. And the process of building the support gives you all the structural integrity of the bridge itself. You get the support in place, and then the bridge just kind of gets slapped on top of it, and then you weld it together and you're good to go. If there are any mechanical engineers in the audience, I severely apologize. But that is roughly the concept. And it does actually work for brains as well, and human concepts, and talking with people and understanding things and building language. That you don't just throw a word in the air and teach a baby the language. You give it the support that it needs to understand the concept, like an apple. You don't just yell the word apple at a baby and expect it to eat it. You give it an apple and then you tell it it's an apple. You do it in that order. So why don't we do that with software? And if we do that with software, what does that support look like? What does it actually look like to do that? So like in my company, at that previous company that I was working on, I came in as an engineer, and that lasted for about 2 weeks. And then I found myself accidentally becoming the interim head of platform engineering for the entire company, holding the thing together and trying to grapple with, hiring an actual head of platform engineering, figuring out the architecture, paying down the tech debt, doing too much with too little, and having to build this giant, massive bridge with not enough time, material, or resources, and no idea when to start. So naturally, I started with the tiniest thing. Um, but I had these grand visions of what the company needed because I saw everybody talking past each other. And I saw everybody having the wrong words for things and making the wrong fundamental choices for a lot of different things. And the mired tech debt that was slowing the company down to the point that they couldn't solve the problems that they needed to for the business. So it's kind of like if you give a mouse a feature and you tell it to build the feature, the mouse is going to ask for some milk for the cookie. I mean, feature for the cookie, for the feature. The mouse is going to ask for maybe not milk. Maybe they want to know what the feature looks like. But before you get the feature, they're going to need to dig all the way back into what does the code base look like and what does the architecture look like. And before you can improve that, you need to go and figure out how to improve and rewrite maybe some of the infrastructure and maybe some of the containers and maybe the Kubernetes cluster. And before you know it, in order to effectively build what you need, it's really, really easy to try and start with the tiniest little thing and end up wanting to rewrite the entire universe. And try as I tried really, really hard to not rewrite the entire universe. And at this particular company, we actually ended up having to for really funny and entertaining reasons. But it's so easy to do that. Like, it's so easy to start with one tiny little thing and say, okay, we're just going to start here. And before you know it, it feels like rather than building the bridge, you've built a house of cards and you're just trying to stack the cards on top of each other and hope that they all fall down at the same time and create a bridge. But that doesn't work, right? Like you can't just rebuild the universe by having all fall into place in the sky. We need to go even littler, even tinier. But again, no matter how tiny, no matter how simple I try to do something, no matter how small, people get mired in the day to day, in the tech debt, in the firefighting, and change what's not actually happening. And more importantly, people continue to be talking past each other. So I sat down and I was like, okay, this abstraction thing, this, what we're trying to do in order to get the company and get the people and the engineers where they need to go so that they can actually do things instead of just fighting tickets all day or fighting incidents or spending all day sprinting to end up where you started. How do you actually get out of that situation? And so when I thought about it, I was like, okay, so if an abstraction is something that you use to shape and articulate the desired emergent behavior of a system, rather than trying to address the problem, you actually kind of almost avoid the problem and you support the environment needed in order to get the solution that you want. Rather than trying to build the solution, you build the environment in which the solution happens to exist. And it sounds backwards, but it's like giving a baby an apple, and then when the baby is happy and loves apples, then you tell it it's an apple. And like when you build the support for your bridges, you build the support, you pour the concrete, you get the rebar in there, you wire up everything, and then you start building the road. If you start trying to figure out how to build the road before even figuring out what the support looks like, you're never going to get anywhere. So the desired emergent behavior, you have to kind of start with how do you even describe that? What does it look like for the system to be behaving how you want it to? And even more importantly, what does it look like to figure out how to mesh with that? Like if you can figure out how you want it to behave, and it can sort of describe how it's currently behaving, how do you bridge that? Pun intended. I, at this time, at the company, really loved reading a lot of the stuff that Dr. Kat Hicks is putting out with her developer thriving and developer experience and lots of other papers around blending cognitive psychology with developer research because it attacks and addresses exactly these types of problems. And around the same time that I was grappling with all these problems, I ran into a really lovely paper from her on developer psychological interventions and how interventions coming from the idea of a psychological affordance can provide sort of this explanation of why sometimes when you try and fix the system, it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And spoiler alert, it does come down to the support. But how do you think about the support? How do you build it? Rather than just going support and just, hitting a bunch of things and seeing what happens, or labeling a bunch of things and nice thing, or giving people a swag, I don't know. Rather than just messing around with it, it turns out there is actually an idea of support that works for humans in social groups. And it's called an intervention. And it's not the you've been playing video games too long intervention, but it can kind of sound like that sometimes. This intervention is essentially you have this really cool metaphor that she brings up in the paper called a seed and a soil. So if you want to plant some flowers, or if you want to plant some food and grow it, you have your seed and you have your soil. And if you take a bunch of plants from a tropical area and then you plant them in the frigid north, they're probably not going to do well. But if you plant them where they're supposed to grow, they're going to do great, probably. But sometimes they don't. And you might go, why is that? So an intervention would be the process through which you figure out and diagnose, okay, is the seed being grown in the wrong spot? Is the soil not quite right? And then you adjust the soil, you adjust the support, you adjust everything that you need in order for the seed to have the best chance of success. And then you nurse the seed, watch it grow, name it something cute, and you're good to go. So you have these two metaphors that you brought up in the paper, and these metaphors are like game changing for me because they gave me sort of the foundation that I needed to help reason about and give everybody the tools that they needed to understand why the best approach at the time to fix the infrastructure was to work on not the infrastructure. Because that's a very backwards concept for a lot of people. And in an organization that wanted results yesterday, nobody was really happy with that. And so this gave me a really, really nice way of explaining to people you have to start with the support. You need to. The research even says so. So interventions are like the seeds. They're something that you drop into the ground to see what grows. To see, like, you're trying to grow a garden, right? You're trying to grow something beautiful. And you need to grow, you need it to happen, you need it to work. But the soil, the environment, the conditions, the what's there really, really determines how well the interventions that you pick are going to work. And so if you want to try and fix the system, if you want to try and build this abstraction, if you want to try and build this bridge, but you don't have the right support in place, it's just not going to work. And so we ended up with this company culture, the politics, the dynamics of how people are promoted or demoted or rewarded or incentivized, how roadmaps are formed, what gets praised, what doesn't get praised, what's contentious to work on, what's not contentious. All these little soft things are the environment in which helps you determine what's going to work and what's not going to work. And then, most importantly, combined with all of that, you can't just take some diagnostic criteria and some seeds and throw it together without first understanding what is the company doing, how did it get there, what were the choices people made along the way, how did that happen? If you have healthy soil and you have good plants that you want to grow, but the soil is missing a lot of key nutrients because it's been overgrown over and over and over again, it turns out you're not actually going to plant anything worthwhile. And the same is true with a lot of other things like bridges. If you build the bridge and you build the foundation and you build the construction and you build the support and you build everything, but the bridge is not actually designed for the environment it's going to live in, you might give it all the support it needs, but you're not going to actually give it the support that's going to work in that environment. You cannot build a bridge in London the same way as you build a bridge in Sydney. They're completely different. They have to have different fundamentals in where you place and design the support. So at this company that I worked at, we started off with developer experience. And the reason we started with developer experience as our main sort of first interventions is because we had over 100 developers. We had a lot of infrastructure, we had a lot of things going on, and very, very little visibility into the context. Very little understanding of what the soil was, very little actual concrete evidence of what developers were actually struggling with. We had no idea what interventions and what support people actually needed. We knew what everybody was yelling about, but we didn't know if what everybody was yelling about is what everybody is yelling about or just the really loud squeaky wheels. And we also didn't know if the things people are complaining about are actually the things that need to be addressed. Because it turns out developers are particularly bad at understanding what's going to make them more effective. But they're really good at telling you what's annoying. And those aren't always the same things to be fixed. And that was really interesting to find out. But so when we did the developer experience thing, it was a concession of we can't rebuild years worth of infrastructure in a day. We can't rebuild it in a week or even a quarter. But we can send out a survey. We can study the developers. We can ask them, and they can feel heard for the first time in years. And we can start somewhere. We can do that in a month or two, or maybe even less. And that will give us something. And we can start to make real progress for the first time. And that's what we did. And that helped us understand what soil is fertile, what soil is not fertile, what conditions are in place, what incentives are actually incentivized versus not, and most importantly, where we can start. So in the first couple quarters there, what we did was we made a lot of progress. And it really truly felt like we had made about 80% of the progress that we needed to get something really moving, to start changing things, to start developing those abstractions. And then it turns out that, have you ever heard about the first 80%? And then all of a sudden you need the second 80%. And then there's the third 80% and the fourth 80%. And at some point you stop counting 80% because, oh man, oh man, oh, oh, that sucked. Estimating your impact in one quarter is demoralizing, horribly demoralizing. You should do it, but you should do it with the intention of laughing at yourself about it. So I would actually like to ask you all right now, how do you right now try and think about estimating what kind of impact and change you can do in a quarter?
I mean, I'm gonna buy it, I guess. So I think for me, I actually don't. I try to find longer term things that I really like and walk backwards from there and try to find something that looks like that. And then, uh, kind of hope that it will be there eventually, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but that's where I start. Sometimes you can see some goals that you can achieve in a quarter, but it just feels like everything you talk about when it comes to abstractions and seeds and stuff like that, very rarely do they fit in such a small context.
And I totally agree with that. It's really hard for them to fit in a small context of like a quarter, but it's also one of those things that's interesting of even though they don't fit in a quarter, you still want to kind of see how they're doing. Like you want this, how do you know whether or not you should be happy about your progress in a quarter or whether or not you should change your progress? Like, how do you think about that? Is that something that you can do in a quarter? Or
Absolutely. I think so. I think if you're not looking at some sort of data um, that helps you validate really that you're doing the right thing, I think that's a bit naive, isn't it?
that makes sense. My particular favorite strategy is to look at my roadmap, pick two items that I don't care about, one that I do, and then throw everything away because nothing will get done anyway. Just kidding. But it really feels like that's what you're doing sometimes. And it honestly demoralizing is sometimes the right word. And so when you're in this system context of you're trying to make a change. You're trying to improve things. You broke it down to the smallest, tiniest little piece that you could, and even that was too big. And then you went, okay, well, we'll start at the support, and even that was too big. And then you'll start at the start of the support, and even that was too big. And then you start doing something, and it doesn't seem to be moving anything after a quarter or two. And then what? Are you ever actually going to be able to build your anything? Are you actually going to be able to get to the point of doing whatever it is that you want to do when it comes to understanding how to actually make a difference in the system? Or are you just stuck? So I reached a point here where at this company, we were pretty stuck. We were making incremental progress in developer experience, but the developer team for the infrastructure and the platform engineering team was completely stuck in a rut. And the product engineering team, we kept adding new product engineers, but because of the scaling of the system and the scaling of the coordination points between everyone, what was actually happening in hindsight is the more engineers you added, the slower everything got because the coordination of cooperating between the larger amounts of people meant that nothing got done because all the bottlenecks were not being addressed. And nobody wanted to hire infrastructure engineers because they weren't doing anything. But the reason they weren't doing anything because nothing was workable and they were so underwater that they didn't look visible. They were about 800% oversubscribed. And so you actually can't see them doing anything because they're drowning so thoroughly. And so what we ended up having to do was leverage points. Danella Meadows has this really, really beautiful, beautiful setup of leverage points. And she talks about points of influence in the system. But it turns out that's a lot of words. So let's break that down. You have a whole bunch of leverage points. A lot of words. Okay. Well, as someone who's not an executive, what can you do if you don't have the magical hammer of screw you or doing this? It turns out you can do roughly of all the 12 different things in a system, you can probably do these. But if you notice, these are not actually the impactful leverage points in the system. And so that is what we were experiencing with the developer experience research and the efforts to actually try and improve things with the limited amount of authority that we had. We were driving positive feedback loops. We were working on getting the negative feedback loops to be minimized. We were trying to and it wasn't really doing anything because those aren't the most impactful leverage points. So you had to go up a notch. And so you have two options to go up a notch. We actually did both simultaneously. For the developer experience side of things, we went through and we were actually able to go in and do a little bit of work to actually change how people thought about things. So we'll get into what that looks like in a couple different ways. So you can do it with abstraction, you can do it with authority. Abstraction is a lot more lasting impact, and authority lets you do certain things policy-wise. The first thing that we did is transcending a paradigm. The paradigm that we needed to transcend with authority was it is useful and productive to hire infrastructure engineers to fix the bottleneck so that the product engineers can do stuff. Readers, this took 9 months. 9 months of convincing people before they realized that doubling the product engineering headcount and allotting one headcount to infrastructure engineers over 24 months was not acceptable. You're welcome. Yeah, so when you fixed that situation by getting the leadership team to reevaluate and understand what they needed to do, we actually did this really, really entertaining thing of the platform engineering team. And at this point, I had finally helped hire a head of platform engineering, and now I was the principal architect, which is what I was originally hired to do in the first place. It only took 9 months. And so we stole the headcount from the entire rest of the organization for 2 quarters and went from 800% oversubscribed to 20% oversubscribed, which is way better. And then we were able to drop a whole bunch of other stuff now that we can understand what's actually going on, where the time is being spent, where it's not being spent, what's useful, what's not useful. And doing that and being able to redefine what work we actually even do got us to a point where we could gasp, start actually even working on the problem. It turns out the reason infrastructure engineers weren't doing anything is because they couldn't work on the problem. The only thing they could do is turn the fires off and on and wait for them to start up again. When you fix that problem, it's miraculous how many things people can do when they actually have time to do it. Who knew? That was in here. But then once we had addressed some of those, we had finally started to take these leverage points and utilize them effectively. Now abstraction had to come into play. So what was happening was you had product engineers and you had this really interesting setup where the product engineers were simultaneously responsible for their infrastructure and not responsible for their infrastructure. You had infrastructure engineers responsible for the infrastructure and not responsible for it at the same time. This was not effective. We fixed that. And then in doing so, immediately ran into other bottlenecks. And so in addressing these and playing whack-a-mole, I had to sit back and realize now it's actually finally time to do the abstraction thing that we were supposed to do and we were trying to do. Finally, the soil had become fertile enough. The support had gotten there in the right places. With the extra headcount, we had an entire developer experience team. We had a platform engineering team. We had data engineering teams for the first time ever in a company that specializes in data. Anyway, we were finally able to make meaningful progress. And in doing so, we could do this magical, beautiful thing called work on the abstraction. And the abstraction that we needed to do was engineers currently, in order to build any feature or develop anything or work on anything whatsoever, have to deal with this weird quagmire setup of the jankiest, weirdest, most homegrown solution you've ever seen for CI, continuous delivery, the infrastructure, the auto scaling, things are broken left and right. And we had rigorous compliance frameworks and we had regulations we had to deal with. And it ended up being such a mess to even touch that we couldn't upgrade anything without breaking all of it. So, despite trying super, super hard to avoid a full rewrite of the infrastructure, we had to actually attempt the full rewrite of the infrastructure, which was the power to transcend paradigms right there. But the way to do that would have been too costly. It would have taken years. And we didn't have years. We had months. And on top of that, we had to let developers continue to mess with everything and get it working while we are trying to rebuild everything in motion as they're going, while supporting them, while building the support that we need in order to be able to hot swap everything over at the same time with no loss of traffic. That was fun to figure out. And it was essentially impossible to do with any way that they were thinking of the problem. Because the way they were traditionally thinking of it was taking the code base of the infrastructure, maybe forking it, maybe doing the stringler pattern thing, maybe trying to modify and edit all of the deployment configurations. And all of those are so fragile, every single one of those approaches failed miserably, absolutely miserably. So I decided to sit down and rewrite the rules of reality, which turns out to be really effective. So if you rewrite the rules of reality, you can do a lot of really cool stuff. So we built, using Argo CD and a couple other things, a completely not touching the disk not touching the source code, not whatever, in place, modifying the infrastructure code, modifying the actual deployment codes, all these other things so that we didn't edit or touch anything that was currently existing, but we could upgrade everything, multiple versions of Python, multiple major versions of Kubernetes, multiple everything else, fix a whole bunch of bugs, fix all the weird quirky things that the engineers had done that because they didn't know better, and give them a complete annotated list of every single change that they needed to make in order to have everything run on the new platform. And then you could keep everything in lockstep with the code and merge everything on, give them the support, teach them how to use the system, and have everything working and ready. And then you could simultaneously run traffic to the new clusters and the new clusters at the same time because they're running the same stuff. And they're running the exact same code. So that's safe to do. And can have them hooked up to the same database, which is weird. Typically don't do that, but in this case, it did actually work. And then once you have validated the test and done everything, you can slowly cut off traffic to the old cluster, keep everything running for a couple weeks, and then slowly decommission that. But nobody would have ever thought of that solution because who tries to do something that stupid? Who is actually, asinine enough to attempt to upgrade 8 versions of Kubernetes in one go with YAML, regex, and Argo CD and bash scripts inside of YAML, inside of but it worked. And if you rewrite the rules of reality, you can actually do that. The cool thing about abstractions, you can do that with anything, right? So when it comes to rewriting the rules of reality, you can get really, really clever with it. So there was another actual really, really cool problem that I had in a different company. This was one of the first companies that I worked at. And they had this problem. They were a contracting company, a consulting company, actually. This company billed per hourly, because, that's how they had to do it. They billed hourly. They did a lot of DARPA projects, they did a lot of DoD, like defense, Department of Defense, and certain types of academic research style contracts. They didn't build bombs or anything ridiculous like that. They were actually very ethical, but they did a lot of very, very cool cryptography research and other things like that. But you would end up having everything built from scratch for the one project and then decommissioned and torn down after. And the projects would often use the same language, the same libraries, the same things over and over. So they were spending 30% of their project budget redoing the same things over and over again. Why? Because that's what you do. You take a single project, you estimate it clean slate for the hours, you get the bid, you submit it, you get it approved for the statement of work, and then you work on it. And so when they hired me as a DevOps engineer for the first time, that was what they were doing. And I looked at things and I said, aren't we literally copy and pasting things over and over sometimes and just changing words here and there? Like, what's actually going on here? Can I just not build one thing for you all so that you all have something that just works everywhere? And they couldn't do that. And the reason for that is because who are you going to build it to if it works for everybody? When your paradigm of how you perceive what you do is so entrenched in what you do and how you do it that you can't perceive of other ways to approach the problem, you can dig yourself into a very expensive hole. And so at this company, one of the things that I did was I waited for the right opportunity. There was about, at one point in time, 10 different contracts inside the company running simultaneously using the same exact libraries, the same exact, sets of infrastructure, needed the same types of things. And normally the ask for me would have been to write CI pipelines and infrastructure, help build containers and help set up all of the infrastructure components of the problem and the testing suite and all these, various components 10 different times by scratch each time. So I saw how similar all these were, saw the opportunity and grabbed some allocated coach hours from every single project, and then took all of my personal overhead hours, smuggled them away, and ran off into the darkness screaming. And then when I emerged about 3 months later, I had built them for each project what that project needed. What I built was a reusable solution for the entire company because I rewrote the laws of reality. And when I did that, their their problem was they couldn't figure out how to build and bill a reusable project to multiple projects. Once I, in a somewhat sneaky fashion, solved that, it allowed me to actually have the time and bandwidth needed to build them the universal thing that they needed. And the funniest thing about that is it was a self-hosted Kubernetes platform using Terraform, Kubernetes, Ansible, GitOps, a couple other things. And it ran auto-scaling runners for GitHub and GitLab, and it had like self-hosted object stores and a couple other things. And it did everything that they needed it to. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And I took that sucker and I launched it on a Friday afternoon. And I closed my laptop lid and I did not even look at the results to see if it worked. And then I left for parental leave for 4 months. And it worked because I'm awesome. Don't do that. But it worked. It was pretty cool. And they had one small question, but other than that, they were able to operate it flawlessly. And due to a bunch of unforeseen circumstances, I ended up having to actually submit my notice, 2 weeks notice to the company the day that I came back from parental leave, which I felt really bad about. But I spent the remaining 2 weeks documenting the entire system. And then when I was a couple years later, writing my talk on platform engineering for QCon on successful platforms that I have built, I thought to myself, maybe I should check myself before I wreck myself and ask them how much they hate me, what I've been up to. It didn't work. And so I actually called them up out of the blue and said, so yeah, that the thing that I built for you, like, 4 years ago, what happened? And turns out I got the biggest ego boost I have ever gotten in my entire life. I did not need it because I was already self-confident, but whew, it turns out the platform was everything that they needed, but they didn't know that they wanted. And once they had it, it was amazing. It boosted the productivity of the entire company substantially. They were able to have it operate perfectly. It's basically never broken, and it's been so robust that they've been able to strip out most of the bootstrapping code that I wrote for in case this thing never breaks, it's just never broken. And they were able to expand it and scale it out to the point that it runs the CI and supporting infrastructure for every single project in the company, allowing them finally to have reusable templates and then start a project in an hour instead of 2 months. And that has allowed them to continue doing what they do in the face of increasing stringent requirements of this research should actually be usable and have infrastructure stuff, and you should treat it like a real software. They've been able to do that now because I rewrote the laws of reality and gave them something really cool to help them out. Which learning that me just doing that moonshot worked perfectly beyond all conceivable belief. I probably did not need that level of hubris in my life, but there we are. And so it turns out bridges are built with communities. You need the support, and support has to be in multiple different dimensions. You need the right circumstances, you need the right environment, you need the right nudge, you need the right intervention, the right seeds, lots of water, and happy little sunshine. And when you have all these things and the right group of people, you can do incredible things. So one of the things that I would love to hear from you all now is, what is your favorite abstraction? And what is your favorite thing that you have built for the community that you're really proud of? And why are you so proud of it? You mean it.
Actually, trying to think about favorite abstraction is a non-trivial exercise, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And trying to think about also like what's the a thing that you build for a community can be kind of like, I don't know if they're the same. Um, and I'm also trying to kind of integrate all of that into the what you just showed us, which is I'm trying to kind of package it into my brain and see how that matches my lived experience. Um, so I don't know what is my favorite abstraction with all of that. Like I'd like to also hear other people because I've been totally like, oh hey. So and I know there's other people here that are well able to do that,
Yeah.
to talk about their favorite abstractions.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite abstractions is actually inside jokes.
Okay. How's that an abstraction?
So inside jokes or like little sayings that make no sense to anybody outside the group. They're some of my favorite. So like my dad has a saying of that's sixes, like the number six. But that comes from the phrase it's six of one, half a dozen of another, which is an idiom for, well, it's about equivalent. But you could just say, it doesn't matter. But instead, he says, ah, it's sixes. And then we have to spend about 5 minutes explaining why that makes sense to absolutely everybody in earshot. And it is the funniest thing to me every time. And I just find it hilarious. And it's one of my, favorite silly little abstractions because it's so ridiculous. So ridiculous. But it's very funny.
I see that totally as a thing that brings people together, like as a thing that kind of builds, oh, I can talk about this. Suddenly it goes from like a world, it's exactly this, right? I think we're in this setting of an online meetup, and you ask a question, and it is, as a speaker, like it's a slightly awkward thing because you're like, maybe nobody will reply. But then someone replies, and maybe you say, who doesn't like videos of cats? And people suddenly start thinking, and maybe they'll show you a picture, and then suddenly you're so it's a way to kind of I see that as a kind of trust building, sense making type exercise. So that's kind of on the tools of uh, trying to build trust, build like a safe space. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so I think now if we were on one of the abstractions that I maybe I would like is a lot of that about that. You can't build systems without without doing that, without a community, without
Mm-hmm.
people that you can talk to and that they can talk to you in a in an equal footing, as in like they can say what they're thinking, and the degree to which they can or they can't say what they're actually thinking is the pretty much the an excellent measure of the possible success of the system, in my experience. But also, what about all the other? We see all of you now starting to get out of into the video camera. So like other people say stuff, pictures of cats.
I was just going to say, if anyone would like to contribute but doesn't want to go off mute, feel free to put it in the chat, and myself or Andrea will read it out for you. In the meantime, I don't have a good abstraction off the top of my head, but I certainly have a bad abstraction that sometimes gets a joke, which is one of the first startup I was involved in was initially selling food, and we built an abstraction around sandwiches because custom sandwiches was a key selling point of this service, and so you could order a sandwich and then customize the ingredients on the sandwich. But because we're very smart, we wanted to make it very abstract. It was just orders and order items could be children of other order items. So a slice of cheese was an order item that was a child of an order item that was the sandwich. And then it turned out that they also wanted to sell other things through this service. It was for schools, and they wanted to sell school uniforms. And so it ended up being that the size of a t-shirt was the same, had to fit into the same abstraction point as a slice of cheese on a sandwich. And I thoroughly do not recommend that abstraction. That was a terrible abstraction that caused immense confusion for everybody. But it does connect to the second part of your question, which is what have you built for communities, which actually that experience inspired me. And it's something that I can share about, which is an open source tool I've been working on called Contextive, which is supposed to, I guess, create a new kind of abstraction around the way we talk about language, in that you can create documentation of your domain terminology, and the tool will make it easier to capture that and also surface it in IDEs and potentially in the future in other places like Slackbots and browsers and things like that. So you can get like tooltips on in your code that actually is more oriented around what does this word mean in the domain rather than what does it mean technically. That was definitely inspired by having to explain to developers that order item could be a slice of cheese or the size of a t-shirt.
That is phenomenal. Okay, I have to know. Could you order a BLT sandwich, a bacon, lettuce, and t-shirt? Please tell me that was possible.
Well, if you misconfigured it appropriately, absolutely. You could order a combo meal with the size of the t-shirt as one of the options of the combo meal. Terrible, terrible experience. Not recommended.
Yeah, I don't have a real, I think of a good example of an abstraction, but I've definitely over abstracted things. And that's what I'm trying to do less, because I find you get a layer of abstraction on top of another abstraction on top of another abstraction. You actually lose the true source of whatever it was that you were trying to abstract. And in the end, all I was trying to do was hide complexity. And instead of hiding the complexity, I just shifted the complexity elsewhere and never truly hit it. That's kind of the pattern that this is specifically more with coding and yeah, developing abstractions within code. So that's my bit that I can share, but I can't think of a great example of a good abstraction that I've done.
Have you ever built an abstraction that didn't hide the complexity, but made it more understandable?
Yeah, I'm sure I have, but I can definitely look back on past abstractions and like probably didn't need to go too deep, too many layers. Generally, I'm trying. Generally, a lot of the time, like you're trying, like you don't like the syntax of something, so you hide it away, but then someone else doesn't understand why you've done it that way, and they just need the regular syntax, and it'll be perfectly fine. So yeah, for myself, I'm just trying to be mindful of not over abstracting.
I can
That
think of
makes
an
sense.
example actually where I think I was going to say event driven stuff for an abstraction that I like, but I can think of an example where I used it to surface the necessary complexity, right? There's like the essential complexity of whatever you're building, and then there's the incidental complexity where, for me at least, I didn't really think about how I was going to design something, and now it's way more complex to hold. But the thing that I really liked with the kind of event-driven architecture was I used a library that essentially allowed you to, in a single place, create a declarative state machine. So the state machine was essentially this business process, basically. And so we could receive events from various different system integrations that kind of all fed into the state machine, and all of the transitions were controlled in one place. And so I think I really like that abstraction because it put all of the necessary complexity of understanding business rules, understanding what can turn into something, what can't, into a single place, and allowed us to kind of drive it in a really scalable way. I think the proudest moment with that system was when the internal code name, which was AlfiePay, named after my dog, actually became public. So now there is a real product in the public eye that is named after my pug. And if you look at the website, it has a picture of my dog on it. So 10 out of 10, best thing I've ever built.
I really hope that's on your resume because it absolutely should be. Like that crowning achievement right there.
I think I've built
Fantastic.
quite a few leaky abstractions. I think when, like, a lot of the tools that we use to build like platforms, especially cloud platforms, they have great ways of creating abstractions. Like Terraform, you can create these reusable modules, or Helm, you can do a similar thing for Kubernetes resources. And I find it very easy to get to a point where you can expose that with a command line interface or a button or something for the developers, but then very quickly, you're presented with like a diff or something or an error, and all of a sudden that diff and that error really requires a lot more context into the technology itself. So like this thing that you were trying to abstract is now kind of leaking, internal details. And I feel like that's a problem that I see quite a bit of.
That is such a common problem. And I don't necessarily know if we have a universal way to solve it. But I do know that some people have called it the 200% problem of you have the complexity of the original problem and the complexity of the abstraction. But Adam Jacobs' System Initiative has actually called it the 300% problem because, as you're probably aware, you have the initial complexity of the problem, the complexity of understanding the abstraction, and then where the abstraction breaks, you have the actual the third 100% of the interactions between the abstraction and the original part of the system. So it's not actually double the complexity, it's triple the complexity. And so that's something that's always resonated with me. And it makes me recall that all of my favorite systems to debug are ones where you can smash it with a really ugly hammer. If you need to. If you have this beautiful abstraction, you have this great, but if you need to just dig into this one file that's buried 15,000 transitive dependencies down and change a plus sign to a minus sign for reasons, you could. Is that advisable? Obviously not, but advisable and possible, very different. And all the systems I like are the ones where you can do the really ugly thing. And I think there's, ironically, a lot of beauty in allowing people to build really ugly stuff with abstractions.
Yeah, I like that. That's good.
I have kind of two thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Someone is saying something. Charging stations. Abstraction is locations. Sorry, the font in here is tiny. First, you're not interested if 10 or 30 stations available only the geoposition. Then, when on site, you like to know where exactly an available station with the connection is. Okay, so the abstraction is the charging station. And then something about the location. Okay, makes sense. Right. So what is the question?
I think that was just an example of one of the favorite abstractions.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. So that's Martin's probably answering that.
So Martin, what made that abstraction so nice? Like,
Maybe they're typing.
I think it make it nice that on a map you're not splattered with like 30 icons. You just want to know I can charge at this motorway, and I just want to know if it's in my direction or in the opposite direction, but I don't care about all the details until I arrive there.
that makes sense. Like, it allows you to do the common sense thing that you want to do anyway without a lot of extra ceremony. Does that sound right?
Sorry, I missed the audio. I had a connection problem.
Your mic is on, by the way, Martin, because we could hear you typing.
Yeah, the typing was perfect.
Yeah, I was very impressed.
Oh, I'm sorry. So it seems to. Okay, sorry. Go ahead. Anyway, my example was late.
Cool. So one thing that I was thinking about while all of these conversations about favorite abstractions were going on is I think the question of the abstraction really threw me a little bit, because I was like, oh, what is, like, I went back to like, what is an abstraction? It's like, like words are abstractions, and language is an abstraction, and cultures, and it just went into some sort of loop in my head, which was actually kind of fun. But one thing that I got out of all of you saying your different favorite abstractions is that I think we arrived to nice or useful abstractions in some iterative slash or plus emotional process. And I think this is something you touch on your post, Hazel, that I'd really like to touch on. I think that I think you become, in my experience, you only become better at building or identifying abstractions after you've done it a lot. And even then, you know, it's not like it's easy. We just know that it's painful, and you kind of just kind of live with the discomfort. And I think we don't talk about that in technology a lot, because we're supposed to like not feel feelings or whatever. But it turns out that it's actually really painful, and actually the discomfort is a really good signal. The sadness is actually a really good signal, and I would love for you to kind of talk a little bit more about that, because I thought the way you put it in the post was super powerful.
Yeah. So kind of touching on the idea of people, like, it takes a while, it takes a long time to have the abstractions actually be useful. And we in software really underestimate how much time that is or how easy it is. Like, construction has been evolving for tens of thousands of years. It took us hundreds of years to figure out a nail. Standard sizes for nails. We figured out like a little sharp piece of metal that goes in wood. That took hundreds of years. And we're looking at these complex distributed systems, self-healing, magical, flying ninjas. And we're like, how come this took more than 4 years to figure out? Like, what? It takes a long time. And it's gonna take way longer than we think. But also, because I think we are so close to the quote raw essence of building abstractions, it's one of those weird things where the constraints of the physical world help you with abstractions by giving you limitations, but also the non-constraints of the abstract world, quote unquote, let us really think about what it means to build abstractions, and hopefully we can get better at that as a society a lot faster. But yeah, I really like Yanni, your point on the team is the smaller unit, the smallest unit of delivery. And I do definitely agree about it bringing communities together and having communities build things. It's also that when you're thinking of, is this working? You can't measure individual performance either, particularly for knowledge work. You can't measure individual performance. I mean, you kind of can, but is the team being effective? Is the community being effective? It's this systems thinking thing. And we're really bad at systems thinking, but it's so important to the very group social nature of humans and the actual health of humans being able to function appropriately and build things together. It kind of gets into the sorrow point of when you build an abstraction, you're doing this deeply vulnerable thing of taking how you personally perceive the world and then building this gentle, delicate little idea and then releasing it out into the wilderness to be mauled and ripped apart by everyone around you. And it's not that they're doing this on purpose. Nobody does that. But people don't say, "Oh, I like your idea. I'm going to smash it." It's just that the world is hard, and everybody can come together with the best of intentions and try really hard to work together. And all of your abstractions and all of your thoughts and your plans and how you perceive the world is gonna get ripped apart and invalidated a lot of time. And if you hold on really closely to that very tightly, you can feel like people are invalidating you as a person and how you perceive and connect to the world. And so you need this kind of weird disattachment from your own process of understanding the world if you're going to share an abstraction with people. And that can be really challenging, really, really challenging. And one of the sort of related things that I learned in the leadership role that I had at my last company was you have this paradox of when you're trying to build these abstractions, when you're trying to build an organization of people that's effective and can get things done, you need to simultaneously hold two truths in your head at the same time. The first one is that everything you've ever loved and hoped and wanted to build is going to get crashed and smashed into smithereens, probably. It's all probably going to break. Most of it's not going to work. All your plans are going to get wrecked, and pretty much everything's going to get lit on fire. And in the end, is any of it going to matter? And on the other hand, what you're building is really beautiful, and you have to 100% believe that it's going to work. And if you don't 100% believe that it's going to work, while simultaneously knowing that it's not going to work, if you don't 100% believe that it will work and commit fully into it, it's definitely not going to work. You're playing like this ridiculous game of chicken with your own soul and sanity in order to do this change agency at scale. And it's the weirdest thing because you have to take this group of people that you've helped grown, that you've hired, that you've helped train, that you've taught how to see the world, and you've learned this together. And it feels like you're running them over a cliff. It really does. Like it feels like you're just going straight through a cliff without the brakes. And if you do this hard enough and you believe in it hard enough and you really commit just right, you'll have built the support in time and you'll build the bridge in time to get over the cliff. But it's probably not going to happen.
Wow, that's
But
you've
you
been
have to
working on
believe
that
it.
analogy for quite a while, eh?
Like, mm-hmm.
It's like, oh wait, we need to get to the cliff. It's good.
I saw something recently that sort of was talking about
But I
nihilism
had to
and
take it with me
realism
on the journey.
objects.
I couldn't shortcut to the cliff because then we would have all just jumped off.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I saw something about nihilism recently that was like, you can see nihilism as like everything's gonna die and everything's gonna be terrible, and you can see this as a reason not to. You're like, everything's gonna go, so cool, let's just have fun while we can. Like, I feel like that's a little bit of like embracing the spirit of like you have to let go of these things, but you can see it in a positive way. And if you can create that kind of enjoyment, then you can at least create a community or a positive kind of movement.
There is
Right.
something else there that I learned from Ruth Malan, and she was kind of talking about how our role as kind of systems creators or whatever. I always don't know what word to people feel like they are themselves, but insert your own description of systems builder, I guess, is that we need to make sense of things. And sometimes that means, and it's a weird thing that you have to balance. And I think that's exactly what you're saying, isn't it, Hazel? That thing that we need to be able to hold these two completely opposite ideas in our heads. At the same time, we can't be lazy about bridging the gaps, or like basically there can't be anything that you go, should be grand. You can't do that because anything that you don't pay attention to, the abstraction certainly, it's basically anytime you do that bit of it just becomes a worse abstraction. And obviously you can't do everything at once, so you do that a little bit, then you iterate, then it gets better, and then you do it a little bit. So this sense-making exercise, this pulling the two things, I think that's yeah, that's really cool.
There's a related-ish kind of concept that you just reminded me of that I think is so cool, which is there's I don't know if you've ever heard of an internal locus of control versus an external locus of control. But the concept is essentially someone has roughly an internal locus or an external locus of control. If you have an internal locus of control, you believe that you and your personal actions are in charge of your destiny. Things happen because you do it. You get out of bed, and you have all these, essentially, everything is your fault, for better or worse. And then the external locus of control is sitting there and going, everything just happened to me. Everything happens to me. I am just a wee little human in this infinite sea of other stuff. And it turns out, while that one is kind of more true-ish, the internal locus of control comes with several features and benefits, including substantial health benefits, substantial longevity benefits, substantially less depression. It is basically a healthy level of respectful delusion is necessary to be a fully functioning member of society. It's kind of like recycling, honestly. Is recycling one plastic bottle going to solve global warming? Of course not. Your tiny little bottle is so insignificant to the 100 top companies polluting the earth that it will do absolutely nothing to change the whole scenario. But if you, as a human, don't have that blend of the internal locus of control and external locus of control, it's just going to sit there and do nothing. And if you have only that internal locus of control, you're going to maybe go too off the delusional end and think that everything happens because of you, and you're not going to be able to cope and compensate and handle the fact that sometimes things just suck, or sometimes things do just happen. So how do you balance it? And it really comes to mind of this balancing things, but also taking charge of the agency and having both. It's such a fun little blend to think about. And it reminded me a lot of that. My director in my last company had this phrase because she didn't like nihilism. She liked nihilism as the philosophy, but the word itself has a lot of interesting connotations. The phrase that she used that I really like, and it's my favorite phrase now, is radical acceptance. It's not nihilism as in, oh, woe is me. It's radical acceptance of looking at what is, taking stock, accepting it, and then moving on and doing what you can from there. And I like that. You mean it.
Wow, did you see Yanni's comment there?
I feel like we're
I'm
delving
glad I
into
can
the
be a
whole
therapist.
deep rabbit hole of the illusion of free will and all of that.
I think that any chat like this that winds up being about systems and stuff, if it doesn't end there or in capitalism is the root of all evil, we failed. So I mean, we're in one of them. So I think we're doing good. I mean,
Yeah. But also, like, when you have this dichotomy between individual and group, where you have multiple people, multiple perspectives, multiple inputs into this soupy mess of humanity, free will, as we conceive of it, can't necessarily really exist because you interact with other people you interact with other things, they interact with you. You're not just bouncing around in a void. You know, like it's an interesting concept. But yeah, we are going to run into that odd philosophical concept of what even is life? What is meaning? What are words? Numbers?
Yeah, that's true. What about actually in that context, right? Abstractions. Okay, so when you think about abstractions from a programming point of view, right? You kind of sometimes like to think, at least at the start, that these abstractions do live in the void of your computer. So I mean, I know that this is not what we're talking about, but I think in a way we do it in some ways, because you start there in this kind of slightly contextless. It's like, oh, but this function does this thing. But then you grow it up, it's like, actually, this function is not alone in the world, in the void, and there's all these interactions. And you kind of add on the does other people also have these mental models, I guess? So is that also an abstraction in your perception of abstractions that we're talking today? Or how do you, what is the difference between a function that runs in a processor somewhere and the abstractions about like a joke and kind of an inner joke? Like, what is the relationship between these two things? Sorry, it's kind of probably slightly unfair question.
I mean, honestly, I don't personally see a difference between them. And it sounds radical to some people, but I genuinely don't. Like, an inside joke is an idea, and we give it a name, and we tweaked it a little bit, and then you did it again, and you tweaked it a little bit, and you did it again, and you tweaked it a little bit. And what is our programming constructs if not that? Like an idiom factory, bean counter factory generator thing, where you just input an inside joke and then out comes a funny memory. That sounds like the factory to me, you know? Like, it's abstractions are interesting. And even numbers, to go on to numbers. Are numbers invented or discovered? It's a philosophical question that's been asked for thousands of years and has started at least one war. I don't know. I'm sure it started a war somewhere. But why not both? Like, it's kind of both. They're discovered in the sense that anybody can come up with the idea, but those invented because we like numbers, because we're human and they make sense to us. You know? Like, you have the concept of an amount of something, but we call them numbers and we work with them in a certain way because it makes sense to us. And if it didn't make sense to us, we wouldn't do that. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of abstractions, things that we find useful. If we don't find them useful, we don't call them abstractions, we call them broken garbage. And then we replace it. And then we come up with this other thing that we go, now this is an abstraction. And then 2 years later, you're like, oh, I was so wrong. And then
Something that comes to mind for me is I feel like, often I've started off with built this abstraction and it's fit this use case perfectly, and it's it feels like a good abstraction. It's taking away a lot of the cognitive load of the developers or the people using it. But then another use case comes along and it's a slightly different use case, and you have this decision of whether to copy your abstraction and change it a little bit, or add a new feature to your existing abstraction. And I think for better or worse, sometimes just for the sake of time, we often update the existing abstractions, and many months later, years later, you realize that you've created this kind of monster with 100 different toggles for various different use cases.
one of my so I think one of the things that causes that is when you make a small edit somewhere, it's not that you're making a small edit somewhere, It's that you are describing to other software engineers, when we see something that is similar, we make it uglier rather than having the duplication. And so when other engineers encounter a similar type of problem, they go, the way we at this company solve this is by making the original code a little uglier rather than duplicating something. We would rather have ugly unmaintainable code than duplicate functions that look a little different. And we're communicating that via our code process. And so the way that I counter that is by developing an alternative process that allows for some distance and more reasonable ways of guessing the abstraction, but in a way that is easily explainable to people new to the company or to people new to programming or to people that don't have the context. So like one of my favorite ones is the rule of three. If you see something that's similar, you go, I'm going to copy and paste and duplicate this. And I'm going to write a little, comment next to the function that goes, this is duplicated from this one. This is instance number 2. And the next time you run into something that's similar, you go, aha, I know what to do. This one, I'm going to copy and paste it. Edit slightly, do the changes. This is instance number 3. And if I run into instance number 4, now I know what to do. I'm going to take all 4 use cases and look at them, observe them. What is the actual abstraction commonality that I see? If I do it too early, it's really annoying because I'm going to guess wrong, probably all the time. If I do it too late, now I have to refactor 20 things, and screw that. But 3 isn't too bad. 4 isn't too bad. It's just somewhere around the 3 and 4 problem. Great. And then you can just teach that to people in about 2 minutes. And then they go, okay, and then you make the problem significantly less terrible. But that in of itself is an abstraction, because it's an abstraction of teaching people how do you work with things that have slightly different requirements and how do you evolve your understanding of what does it mean to have different requirements? How do you spot the evolution of abstractions via an abstraction?
Yeah, I love that. That's spot on, I think.
Hazel, you were talking about numbers before, and it reminded me of Belle-Anne Herman's. I don't know if you've come across her language, Hedi. She's been creating a programming language called Hedi, which is for education purposes. And for those on the call who haven't come across it, one of the things that's beautiful about it is how inclusive she's made it, in that you can actually program in other languages, including right to left languages. So the keywords, the syntax supports the languages themselves. And that was designed to make it more accessible and easier for children who don't necessarily speak English to engage with the language. And when she was working with some people to introduce Arabic as a language that you could program in, it turned out that it didn't work with Arabic numerals. And there's an abstraction there around numbers, which is that we assume that Arabic numerals, in English we call Arabic numerals, but they're actually not Arabic numerals as Arabic people use them. And if you try and write code in, say, C# or C++ or Python using actually Arabic numerals, you get these bizarre error messages about it's not a number, it's an invalid string, all this kind of stuff. And it reminded me that even, numbers, mathematically or abstractly speaking, maybe exist out in the world, but as we've encoded them into computers is another kind of abstraction, one that has proliferated massively without necessarily, reconsidering, is it at the right level of abstraction? Are we abstracting the right thing there? Because these Arabic numbers are just letters. Into most programming languages, they're not treated as numbers, which I found hilarious and sad and perhaps relevant to what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's super relevant because it reminds me of typesetting for of all things Arabic, because one of the things that's really cool about Middle Eastern languages is that they were invented thousands of years before by someone who could see the future and really, really hated computers. No other explanation. This person saw the future and they were like, I'm going to build something that's going to break every single typesetting, program, language, format, setup known to humanity. And absolutely nobody is going to figure out a solution that actually works for this. And the only font rendering engine that can even get close to supporting true Arabic representation is Harfbuzz. And the reason they do that is because they embedded an entire programming language inside the font rendering engine to determine how the numbers and letters and everything should look when they're typed in a certain order next to each other and when they're displayed in a certain order next to each other, which may not be the same. And I just love that. I imagine creating an abstraction around representing text. You're going to get it wrong. There's no way you could possibly create an abstraction around representing text when people can just make stuff up and then call that words.
A related topic that I've found fascinating recently is you would have to say that emojis are a form of abstraction around ideas and emotions and responses. And I recently came across a paper that was doing some linguistic analysis of the Twitter corpus, pre it's becoming awful, and looking at how usage of emojis was actually evolving over time in terms of being used in different contexts and evoking different kinds of symbolic responses or emotional responses. So yeah, there's a.
And that's super cool because there's actually another paper that it was a talk actually, that someone gave once, and the talk was on bottom text. For like, if you're a bottom and someone flirts with you in, meme internet culture, you type a bunch of gibberish into the keyboard and then you hit send. And then people joke that if you compliment, someone who is essentially a bottom, that is a random number generator. But it turns out they're not a random number generator because there's an actual abstraction in grammar and syntax around what is constituted informally as bottom text versus not. And you can look at something and know whether or not this person is actually immersed in the culture or if they're just faking it. And then there's a whole set of informal rules that nobody's ever written down until this one blessed person, wrote and actually designed this talk, did a whole bunch of research, crunched the numbers, and then presented it. And what is that but an abstraction?
Absolutely.
So there's a question of how should a group arrive at an abstraction, especially if it's contentious? And when can / should it change? What is the implicit or explicit governance structure on abstraction? So I like this question. It's an interesting one. I think when you're coming up with abstractions, one of the things that's tricky is despite tens of thousands of years of human evolution proving that no matter how perfect of an idea we think something is, we're going to change our minds later. Every single time people create an abstraction, they go, yep, this one's it. We perfected it. _ final dot docs. And just, we don't actually put in any indicators when we're going to change it. So when you come up with an abstraction, I like making it really, really risk-free psychologically in the group to adopt the abstraction. It should be pretty much free to try it out because you should have a really well understood set of, yeah, this isn't working out, we need to change it. Or this isn't, working out, we need to reject it entirely, or we need to rethink it, or maybe these other abstractions over here need to be combined and so on. Rather than figuring out how to adopt an abstraction, it's almost more important to figure out how to deprecate and or change an abstraction itself. And so what I like to do with that is you can actually borrow a lot of terminology from the strategy communities and things like pivot points or SLOs or KPIs or all these OKRs, all these different concepts actually work with abstractions as well. So you just pick the one that your company likes, try it out. Anytime someone has an abstraction, you go, well, what is the OKR for the abstraction? And give it an arbitrary deadline. If it's not hitting something by that deadline, you just roll it back and try it again. And then once you have sufficiently de-risked, try it out, seeing what sticks, then the innovation can start to actually happen. And the innovation is really the point. It's not really about whether or not you have an abstraction. It's, are humans able to evolve their understanding of the problem and how they can solve it and how they share that knowledge and all of those things. That's really the important part. So if you can make that really, really safe in a group to do so that nobody's fearful, you're going to build some garbage abstraction and then be stuck with it for 30 years. If you can get rid of that fear, pretty much everything else is way easier to solve after that. Did that answer your question, Marco? Cool. Any other thoughts? What is this? How to do things without words. Modeling semantic drift of. Oh, it's the emoji paper. Yeah, this is cool. Thank you for sharing that. Going once. If it hit going twice, I'm gonna start breaking out the really bad jokes and nobody wants that.
I think if this is where we want to kind of wrap it up,
Mm.
that's probably okay. It's
Yeah.
like at the moment it's 6 p.m. I think in Sydney, Melbourne, and it's 8 p.m. here in New Zealand. It's you know, like if you're in New Zealand, it's been a long day already. But I have
And it's 1
totally.
a.m. over here.
You win. No, you're totally on the winning side. Like I would be already like sleeping. Like I'm sleepy, and I'm sleepier just thinking about the fact that you're awake at 1. But thankfully you're a night owl, so that's all right. But I
Don't
just.
worry, I'm gonna wake up at 5 a.m.
That sounds horrible. I hope you're not. But I just wanted to say to everyone here that turned up, thank you very much for coming over, for sharing your experiences. Thank you for coming to Virtual DDD. The next time we're meeting will be in 2 weeks. We're doing chapter 7 of the book club. We're doing facilitating software architecture at the same time. If you haven't signed up, go to virtualddd.com/book club. You know, all of them quite obvious places. If you haven't read the book, you can still turn up and hear the discussion. I think the reason why more people are coming towards the end of the book, which is an anti-pattern to most book clubs, is because of the discussion. So please join us. I'm going to stop recording now, and we can hang around for a few minutes if everyone wants to say goodbye. But I just want to say thank you very much. And obviously, the biggest thanks is to Hazel for an awesome presentation chat where we were able to really go and explore the philosophy of abstractions. So with that, I want to say thank you and goodbye, and I'm stopping recording.